Good evening, and thank you all for attending tonight's informative panel discussion regarding Amendment 64 and how women, and particularly mothers, are leading the charge to end marijuana prohibition. My name is Toni Fox, and I'm a volunteer for the campaign and have been a marijuana legalization advocate for 2 decades. I am a mother of 2 children, and I believe it is crucial that we end the prohibition on this plant and stop penalizing adults for using a safer substance. It's my pleasure to introduce 2 women on the panel this evening. The first one is retired Lieutenant Commander Diane Goldstein, and she is also currently a member of LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. With more than 20 years in law enforcement, Diane Goldstein has made numerous arrests as a longtime foot soldier of the war on drugs. After joining the Redondo Beach Police Department in 1983, she rose from a patrol officer and school resource officer to sergeant in the Special Investigations Unit, finally retiring as Lieutenant Commander in 2004. During her time on the front lines, her perspective on the war on drugs shifted gradually to strong opposition. It was a change forged not only through her professional experience, but by the wrenching personal impact of having a vulnerable family member become a casualty of this war. Second on the panel is Miss Betty Aldworth. She is the Amendment 64 Advocacy Director. Betty is Advocacy Director for the campaign. Her work in the field of marijuana policy has focused primarily on community and public relations with patients and community advocacy organizations, educational groups, medical marijuana centers, and affiliated businesses. Betty is spokesperson for the Women's Marijuana Movement and volunteers with Sensible Colorado, the Women's Canna Business Network, and other social justice and drug policy reform organizations. Prior to her work in marijuana policy, Betty worked in the nonprofit sector in Denver for 10 years, including leading a large volunteer team, Project Angel Heart, and the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And it is also our great pleasure to introduce Mr. Neil Frankin. He is the Executive Director of LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. He is a 34-year law enforcement veteran of the Maryland State Police and Baltimore Police Department. During his time on the force, he held the position of commander for the Education and Training Division and the Bureau of Drug and Criminal Enforcement. After 23 years of dedicated service to the Maryland State Police, he was recruited in 2000 by the commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department to reconstruct and command Baltimore's Education and Training section. Early in his career, Neil had served as a narcotics agent with the Maryland State Police. When not working, Neil volunteers his time by serving on many boards and as board president for Turnaround, Inc., providing advocacy, counseling, and shelter services for victims of domestic violence and sexual assaults. Neil is with us tonight to speak about LEAP's outreach to women, communities of color, and other drug war victims. Welcome, Neil.
Well, thank you, Toni. Ladies, thanks for having me and giving me this privilege to say a couple of words here at the beginning of your program. I just want to make reference to 2 important groups of people who are significant in dealing with this issue of marijuana prohibition nationwide. That is moms and cops. And I want to begin with making a correlation with alcohol prohibition from the 1920s. And the reason is because it was moms that played a significant role in bringing alcohol prohibition to an end in the 1930s. They realized the significance of prohibition and the detrimental effect to their children, that children were being recruited by the mobsters into the bootlegging industry. Very dangerous game. And we had that similar thing happening today with marijuana prohibition. In addition to children, their children, my children, being subjected to arrest. Many people in this country have made youthful indiscretion, have had moments of youthful indiscretion, and have tried things such as marijuana. But they shouldn't be subjected to arrest. Police officers now, by the thousands, are realizing that marijuana prohibition pulls them away from doing the work that they truly want to do, and that is to combat violent crime. These 2 groups coming together, law enforcement against prohibition, and our wonderful moms, will make a significant impact on ending this disastrous policy. And I want to end my opening with this. I had the privilege of being with a wonderful group of mothers over 30 days, and it was the Caravan for Peace. It was a delegation of Mexican mothers who traveled the length of this country through 27 cities, talking about their families and the devastation of their families. Many of them lost children in Mexico to the hands of the cartel. Many people already know that marijuana is the #1 product crossing our border into this country. By far, 60 to 70% of the profits for the cartel and organized crime in this country. And these Mexican mothers came to our country, ending their journey in Washington, D.C. with a message that we need to end marijuana prohibition, among other things. So it's not just moms here in the United States, but it's moms across the globe who realize the significance. I am pleased, our organization, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, is pleased to be working with mothers in ending this policy. So thank you, ladies, for bringing this to the attention of the American public.
Thank you, Neil, for everything that you do. We appreciate those thoughtful words. So I'm going to turn this over to Diane Goldstein, who is one of our members.
Thank you, Neil. My name's Diane Goldstein. Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. And I had my own personal epiphanies, both through my professional and my personal life, that brought me to the point where I said the war on marijuana is absolutely wrong. And we are wasting our fiscal resources, and we need to find another policy. Before I found LEAP, I jokingly refer to being my brother's keeper. I had an older brother. We were about 14 months age difference, and my older brother years ago, starting at the age of 10, started self-medicating himself. He was dual diagnosed, and I believe personally today, if medical marijuana was available to him, that he would still be alive instead of dying from a drug addiction on a combination of psychotropic medication and alcohol. He had a long history of on-again, off-again drug usage. He had run-ins with law enforcement, and I did everything in my power to save him, which included leaving him in jail, which I now regret at certain points. And it was that experience with my professional experience as a school resource officer where I truly learned that the one place that our law enforcement services do the most damage is on the war on marijuana and taking the opportunities from our children away. As I explained to my son, when I was growing up, if you got caught drinking or imbibing in a youthful indiscretion, as Neil described it, as our president did, as George Bush did, as President Clinton did, as Newt Gingrich did, and the list can go on, is if he did it and got caught, his life would be ruined. And I really started thinking about my role as a mom. And I recognized a couple Mother's Days several years back that what I needed to do was to ensure that my child, my granddaughter, and nobody else's child would have to be imprisoned and suffer the consequences of being stigmatized by a criminal conviction, losing federal aid to student loan, being ripped apart from their family for simply marijuana. And so I thank the ladies on the panel here next to me because it gives me the strength to talk about this because it really has been difficult. Recently I shared with Neil, I'm back at school, and I shared a blog that I wrote about being removed from the law enforcement tribe. And what's funny is what law enforcement did for me is it gave me the courage to stand up, both when I worked professionally and personally in the last few years, to buck the trend, to take a look at our national policies and to call out our political leaders and our law enforcement leaders to switch to a new paradigm and to return to law enforcement when we were peace officers and not simply policing people. So as I go through this, I want to share a couple facts that I think are important for all our communities to know of how this war on marijuana impacts you in ways that you may not even understand. Currently, there's a drug arrest every 19 seconds for all illicit substance. There's a marijuana arrest every 30 seconds. So in this hour, you can extrapolate how many people will be arrested for marijuana. In 2009, there were more than 1.6 million arrests. 82% of all those arrests were for simple possession. Out of those 1.6 million, there was over 850,000 people in our nation that were arrested just for marijuana. More arrests for marijuana than for any violent crime or any property crime. The U.S. has the highest marijuana and cocaine use rates around the world. And simply, every time we ratchet up the level of punishment with mandatory minimums and ever-increasing harsher tactics, our drug problem becomes worse. We have wasted $1 trillion since Nixon started the war on marijuana. Currently, in the last 40 years, we've spent over $1 trillion. And today, 3 or 4 voters, three out of the 4 voters that are sitting here in our audience believe that the drug war has failed. And that failure is shared in law enforcement. Back in about 2005, 2006, there was a national survey that was conducted, and there was, I think it was somewhere like 17,000 police chiefs and sheriffs that were asked the question, do you believe the drug war has reduced consumption in any way in America? And 82% said no. So our law enforcement leaders, our politicians, know that what we are doing is not working. So what I ask is, at what point do we take a step back and work towards establishing a win-win strategy for not only law enforcement, but for our community? Every time we invest law enforcement dollars into marijuana investigations is one less dollar that goes to solving a homicide, a rape, taking care of a victim of sexual assaults, a property crime, having your house broken into. The one place I saw in my career, both as the school resource officer, working in the Special Investigations Unit, running our narcotics unit, is that we did not make a dent in the drug usage, drug consumption in our community or in any community. All we did is created a vacuum of leadership that allowed more drug dealers to come into play.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Diane.
Betty?
My name is Betty Aldworth, and I'm the Advocacy Director for Amendment 64, the Campaign to Regulate Marijuana Like Alcohol. And I'd like to start with a bit more background on why this issue is important to me. Tony mentioned that my work background in Colorado was in nonprofit work, but I've been an advocate for my entire life. I ran my first action when I was 12, and a very humble action, but it was an action nonetheless. And social justice is something that has been forever important to me and my family. And looking at the problems facing Colorado today, as a 17-year resident of the state, I know that marijuana prohibition is a fundamental cause of a broadly more vast set of issues. And I'd like to talk about some of them. Diane touched on a few. The facts are these. In Colorado today, across the nation, we have a completely unregulated, uncontrolled marijuana market. And it is, do not be mistaken, it is a market. It is a market that is run by criminals, by gangs, by cartels. Marijuana is considered universally available, even by our own federal government. And it is a market that could be regulated and taxed if we take an evidence-based approach to dealing with marijuana in our society. So again, the facts are it is an entirely unregulated yet universally available market where we are misdirecting the resources. So Amendment 64 solves some of these problems for Colorado. It does three primary things. It decriminalizes limited use and possession of marijuana for adults 21 and over in Colorado, where those adults would be permitted to possess and use in their homes small amounts of marijuana. It creates a regulatory system where we take the underground market off of the streets and put it behind counters, where licensed business people would be responsible for essentially vending marijuana in a manner similar to how we're accustomed in a liquor store in Colorado. This system would be heavily regulated and would allow for checks and balances and allow for taxes to be collected. I'll talk about those taxes in just a moment. It also directs the legislature to create rules for production of industrial hemp in Colorado, which would generate untold revenues for Colorado. Industrial hemp is currently illegal to be grown in the U.S. anywhere, but the U.S. is the largest consumer of industrial hemp in the world, all of which is imported from other countries, and Colorado could capture that market quite easily. But what Amendment 64 really does, ultimately, on a social level, is it stops criminalizing adults, creating a set of collateral consequences in the lives of individuals who are simply choosing a substance that is objectively safer than alcohol. It takes this unregulated market that empowers criminals and provides funding to gangs and cartels and places it behind a counter where we are collecting tax revenues. We are able to punish those bad actors who are breaking the law in a much more efficient manner. And it takes this universally available market and places it into something that we are all accustomed to with most consumer substances, i.e. a regulated market. It redirects law enforcement resources. As Diane was saying, we are currently arresting 10,000 adults in Colorado every year for simple marijuana possession. And those arrests, while in Colorado, they don't lead to jail time, it's true, or they don't directly result in jail time. They do create a set of collateral consequences that can be, and often are, devastating for individuals, families, and communities. A marijuana arrest on your record, even for simple possession, even in Colorado today, can mean loss of a job, loss of housing, loss of opportunities for student loan funding, as loss of access to your children if you are in a custody dispute. And again, this is all for choosing a substance that is objectively safer than alcohol, that half of us in Colorado have tried at one point in our lives or another. 500,000 Coloradans will use marijuana this year. And we do not believe that that should make them criminals. And by adopting Amendment 64 in November, Coloradans have the opportunity to shift the way that we are treating marijuana in Colorado, fund schools, redirect law enforcement resources, and create a system that is evidence-based and creates a stronger, smarter Colorado. One thing that I want to touch on briefly before we open up to questions is saved and gained resources, monetary resources from Amendment 64. I mentioned that we do arrest 10,000 adults in Colorado for simple marijuana possession each year. That costs the state an estimated $12 million. If on November 6th Colorado passes Amendment 64, we will see from that the immediate result in 2013 will be a $12 million savings in law enforcement resources. Law enforcement resources are a zero-sum game. They simply because it's not something that is funded more because there are more arrests. There is a set amount of money that goes to law enforcement resources, and that $12 million could be better used in an immense number of ways than on punishing adults for choosing marijuana. Additionally, the sales and excise tax potential from Amendment 64 could be $60 million a year up until 2017, at which point it could be upwards of $100 million a year in Colorado of new sales and excise tax revenues that we could see here. The first $40 million of that annually would be directed to the School Capital Construction Fund, rebuilding Colorado's crumbling schools and taking us from being one of the lowest ranked states in terms of school facilities to one of the highest. Amendment 64 is the right choice for Colorado. It's an evidence-based policy that is sensible. It's a responsible approach to marijuana policy, and I hope that you'll consider voting yes come November 6th.
You know, I wanted to touch on a couple things, and I think it's important for all the parents, all the mothers in particular to understand, is right now, what happens is by the marijuana prohibition occurring not only in Colorado but across our nation, is that we have abdicated control of a place that government should be in. We have given our children to people, cartel members, criminals, gangs, who really don't care about your child. And I know I get this question often, which is the gateway theory question, isn't marijuana the gateway to harder drugs? And I say the reason it's a gateway is because the day that your child goes to a drug dealer and the drug dealer doesn't have any marijuana or laces his marijuana with a harder substance or drug, or basically says, hey, how about if you try a harder substance? And I think that's the critical factor. What we all want from a law enforcement perspective, as my mom and my grandmother perspective kicks in, is I want my child to be safe. And right now, law enforcement, they may say they're proactive, but we're not. We're reactive to market conditions around us economically, no different than the people who deal illicit substances. We react to information come in. We are not proactive. And by controlling and regulating the market, we become proactive and we impose a higher level of security that makes it much more difficult for our children to get access to a drug that is in fact harmful to children. You know, I firmly believe that adult responsible use of marijuana, to me, is in fact less dangerous than alcohol. In my career as in law enforcement, I worked a lot of different assignments. I never once went to someone's home who was under the influence of marijuana, who beat their wife, molested their child, raped and pillaged their neighbor, robbed a bank, or caused a fatal traffic accident. Alcohol, domestic violence, you know, I was in an officer-involved shooting, all related to alcohol. And we really need to take a look at what we're telling our kids. So when we tell our children that if you use marijuana, it's going to lead you to harder substances where you may become addicted, it's a fallacy. What we need to be telling our children is what we tell them when it comes to engaging in any adult-type behavior. We're trying to get them to delay the decision as long as possible using evidence-based practices. And I don't care if those evidence-based practices are talking about, alcohol or cannabis or other illicit substances, or engaging in a relationship with a member of the opposite sex. But that's our job. It's not the government's job to do.
That being said, Diane, and I agree with you entirely on that. That being said, what we do see the government doing very effectively is implementing regulations and controls on the supply side of substances like alcohol and tobacco, where we see that over the last handful of decades, while marijuana remains universally available and just as available as it was 40 years ago, students are reporting that alcohol and tobacco are less available to them than they were just 30 years ago or even 20 years ago. We have programs like the We Card program implemented by the government to reduce teen access to alcohol and tobacco, and what that has led to is a sharp reduction in the use of alcohol and tobacco by youth. And if we take that same sort of evidence-based approach with marijuana, we can also see the same kinds of reductions. And in fact, in Colorado, we have already seen that with the partial regulation of medical marijuana, the partial regulation of the market through a tightly regulated medical marijuana system. In Colorado, we have seen use of marijuana by youth drop 11% in just 2 years.
That's huge.
Since 2009, when we implemented the medical marijuana regulations.
You know what, Betty? You are absolutely right. And I think that's a huge factor is I think it's up to me as a parent to teach my child their morals. But the one place I do want government in is controlling dangerous substances, exactly like you said. And then, here's one of the things that law enforcement doesn't talk about a lot is the money that we spend on law enforcement can better be used in establishing effective evidence-based programs that front-load the system, that do a great job of educating kids to what the harms are of cannabis at their developmental stage. No different than drinking, no different than engaging in sex too early, no different than picking up a cigarette. And so you're absolutely right. If we took that model in combination with providing parents the resources they need to effectively teach their child, and not through the process of like DARE, where, there's a rhetorical overarching goal of our national drug policy, and people don't talk about it much, but I think we need to talk about it. In America, in a free society, we are never going to be able to completely close our borders and prevent bad things getting in. And so in the 40-year span, and very specifically when I started in the 1980s, all of a sudden there was this overarching theme of establishing a drug-free America. And I think that rhetoric, combined with the rhetoric of the war on drugs, has done more to damage families and our communities, and has done something very significant that Neil touched on very briefly. I was hired in California under the statutory authority of being a peace officer. It's very nuanced. At times in our work, you police people, just like military. Sometimes you have to use force. And so that's our job, to protect not only kids but communities from bad people that prey on them. Well, every time a president came in, and I got hired in 1983 under Reagan, and it didn't matter what party it was, every single president ramped up the war on marijuana. And by giving law enforcement more and broader authority through mandatory minimum sentencing, through drug-free school zones, through a variety of different laws, block grants, asset forfeiture, and what that turned law enforcement into is policing people blindly without caring about What is law enforcement's job? What is our metric of success? What are we supposed to be doing with our community? Should we be working with them hand in hand? Or are we being paternalistic, which is what I believe has occurred now, is law enforcement has assumed the role that we are morally correct and we're going to continue to fight this war on drugs because it's a fight that we are going to win at all costs. And what they don't realize is the cost has been the severance of the relationship between the community and law enforcement. And, it's changed drastically. I still go back to the city that I spent 21 years in. I loved the city that I worked at. And I hear from community members in places that I still visit that, things have really changed. Our cops aren't friendly anymore. They don't wave. And in fact, I teach my kids that, no, you shouldn't talk to the cops because I'm more afraid of law enforcement than I am of something bad happening to them. And we need to change that perception. We need to put that relationship back together. It's no different than a parenting relationship. Is law enforcement has a parenting relationship sometimes with their community. Mm-hmm. But what's that parenting relationship should be? Should we be complete authoritarians, or should we work with our community to solve their problems?
I think regardless, what we know is that marijuana prohibition is an utterly failed policy.
Absolutely.
Yes. And though there are plenty of law enforcers and parents in Colorado who certainly understand that marijuana prohibition is an utterly failed policy, and they're seeking a solution. I believe that Amendment 64 is that solution that we're looking for.
Yeah, I think after reading about the amendment there's a lot of very positive things that create win-win situations for law enforcement, for the courts, for the DAs, and for the communities. And what it does is it provides an avenue to take those important fiscal resources, and let me give you a national figure, is enforcement of marijuana laws last year cost our nation $2.67 billion. That's just enforcement. Judicial and prosecution costs was $1.44 billion, and correctional base expenses was $1.66 billion. And so we continue to hear this argument from people that we really don't enforce the marijuana laws. Well, we do, or I wouldn't have these figures. And so from a federal perspective, from a national policy perspective, why aren't we taking these monies and investing them in jobs, critical public infrastructure, strong educational systems, and prevention and treatment programs?
Why? That's a good question, Diane. Very, very good arguments and comments by both of our speakers today. And I think now we'll go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience.
Hi, thank you for all of your comments. My question is about you as mothers and community leaders. Is it hard for you to come out and talk about this publicly? Do you ever worry about the message that you're sending, or if it'll affect your day job or other consequences? Because it can be really hard for women, especially, I think, to speak out about this issue, even if they believe in it. So what advice would you have for people who are kind of on the fence?
I think from my personal experience, I've always been outspoken when it comes to cannabis and our current policies regarding cannabis. I've never really given too much thought to how people are going to perceive what I'm saying. I just speak from my heart. I speak from my experience. And I think that if more moms unite, which we are, there's dozens and dozens of associations and organizations where moms can come out in support of marijuana and law reforms. It just takes one, and we each one of us has a circle of influence. So if we can come out and start talking openly and carrying open a dialogue with those around us, it opens up the opportunity for others to come out and speak and express their opinions and feel comfortable about it. It's never easy to come out and speak about something that's controversial, but I think when it comes to cannabis prohibition, most of the women that I've met through my advocacy all have very strong opinions that prohibition doesn't work. It's a failed policy, and the moms ended alcohol prohibition. The state of Colorado ended alcohol prohibition before the feds recognized the failed policies 80 years ago, and we hope that in uniting and having our voices be heard that we can end the cannabis prohibition.
We just got some good news over the weekend here in Colorado that 51% of Colorado voters, according to a poll by the Denver Post, support Amendment 64, and for many years, support for marijuana policy reform has been growing, not only in Colorado, but nationwide. So people who believe that marijuana prohibition is a failed policy and it's time to change that policy should not feel alone. You aren't. There are approximately 1.2 million Coloradans who agree with you, and hopefully there will be more come November 6th. We're working hard on making sure that we're educating people about why it's important to change this utterly failed policy. That being said, what I have said many times before, and will say again, is that despite the fact that half of us adults in Colorado have tried marijuana at some point in our lives, it does sometimes feel a bit lonely to stand up and say, this is a failed policy about something that might be personally costly to stand up for. But you don't have to be a marijuana user to understand that marijuana prohibition is an utterly failed policy. Just looking at the facts that marijuana is universally available, it funds an enormous underground market where we are misdirecting our resources, where we are punishing our children, our youth, through the collateral consequences that are weighed on their parents, where we are disconnecting families, where we are destroying communities. These are all the realities of the war on marijuana. And when you consider that it is a substance that is objectively safer than a substance that we sell in stores regularly every day, why? It doesn't make any sense to continue to treat marijuana in this illegal fashion. We can simply remove it from the unregulated yet universal market and put it behind a counter where someone is asking for ID, where safety is ensured, and where we can keep better track of it.
You know what? I think you touched on something that's significantly important. I belong to a group called Moms United to End the War on Drugs, and the diversity of this group is really amazing because it's moms who have never used drugs before. It's moms who have lost children to the war on drugs. It's moms who believe that they should be able to responsibly use marijuana. It's an amazing group of people. And what everybody clearly understands is the failure has impacted our society in so many different ways. And so it's okay if you're a mom, if you're a soccer mom that's never used cannabis before, who understands what the issues are, to come out and say, you know what, we need to discuss this, because at the grassroots levels where we're going to make our government officials and our political leaders understand that we need change and we're going to demand it, and we're going to hold you fiscally accountable for what is going on in our society.
Agreed. Excellent. Another question from the audience?
Thank you for coming out tonight, ladies. It was very insightful and good information. And Betty, if marijuana is legalized in this state, what safeguards are there that will keep it away, keep it secure and out of the hands of my children and others?
It's very important to note that with Amendment 64, while it does decriminalize adult possession in small amounts for people 21 and over, there are criminal penalties that remain in place for misuse shall we say, of or misappropriation of marijuana. So providing marijuana to a minor will remain a criminal penalty for adults. Driving under the influence of marijuana, that law does not change. It is illegal today to drive under the influence of marijuana in Colorado, and it will remain so. And Amendment 64 explicitly allows the state legislature to address that question. And while we're on the topic on this particular topic, let me also mention that it doesn't change employment law in any manner, still protecting the drug-free workplace as well as other important employment policies for the employers in Colorado that might be concerned about that. But when we're talking about a regulated system being a safer system for youth, what we know is that today the unregulated market, which is universally available on the street, is completely accessible to youth. If we place marijuana behind a counter, those business people who will have fought hard for licensing, for the ability to have the privilege of selling what will now be a regulated substance, they will be closely monitored as we closely monitor purveyors of other controlled substances. And so if they were to make an inappropriate sale, there will be penalties up to and including losing their license, as well as civil and potential criminal penalties for that. Additionally, we know that once marijuana is placed into a regulated market, it's going to make it less accessible for youth because the underground market is going to no longer need to exist. Essentially, when you can go to the store, you don't need to go to the street corner or the alley, and so that unregulated underground market is going to disappear.
Great, thank you.
You know,
Thank you.
as part of that answer is, when's the last time that you've ever had a high school kid selling alcohol on campus? You know, or you talk about eliminating the black market and violence associated with it. When's the last time anyone's committed an assault or a robbery to get a bottle of booze? You know, that has so by regulating it, and it's counterintuitive, and I think that's a lot of moms have that struggle because it is counterintuitive. Right. Is that by regulating it, it creates a much safer environment for your child. And it's the one thing that we need to focus on. And I think one of the questions I always get asked is, well, what kind of message does it send to our children? And I always say the message that it sends to our children is that there are things that adults are responsible enough to use. Yes. No different than cigarettes, no different than alcohol. And what we have to do and what the government's role should be is in implementing programs that implements harm reduction strategies that teaches our children the impact of marijuana or alcohol or cigarettes on a developing body and brain. Mm-hmm. And realistic education with controlled regulation markets will do more to continue to drive down that experimenting by kids. And I think it will open communication lines between parents and their children that they didn't have it at some point. Because there's a lot of parents that are still afraid of talking to their kids about the realities of illicit substances and alcohol. And so maybe there's a way to open up that education level to all parties.
And, you know, it's interesting that you mention, that you say, when's the last time you heard of a kid selling booze on school grounds? We've actually seen a reduction in the number of students reporting that they are able to purchase marijuana on school grounds since 2009. That same Center for Disease Control Youth Risk Behavior Survey reports that fewer youth have witnessed a transaction, a marijuana transaction, or feel like they are able to access marijuana on school grounds.
I think what's very interesting, because Colorado, the regulation of the medical cannabis system because, and although it's been legal since 2000, it wasn't implemented in 2009. So you really had your legislatures crafted a very sound regulatory process, which has been part of the problem in California. Mm-hmm. It's been kind of a free-for-all because there hasn't been a governing body that says this is how we're going to need to do it. And so with the ability to control it from growth to point of sale medically, you know that the system works. So for people who may distribute outside of that regulated market, there will be law enforcement consequences to that behavior, and it'll be much easier to go after them. So again, that controlled and regulated market creates a win-win strategy for law enforcement to identify people
Absolutely.
who are violating the law, which is, again, what we want.
It creates efficiencies in law enforcement that you wouldn't expect, or
Absolutely.
that I wouldn't have expected before I started investigating this issue.
No, absolutely.
Yep, agreed. Are there any additional questions from the audience?
Yeah, my question is for Diane. Are you in touch with people that used to be your colleagues in law enforcement, and how did they react to your change in views?
Thank you.
You know, it's a mixed bag, is about the best way to describe it. I have lost quite a number of friends, and I've also had quite a number of people that I've worked with who have come up to me. In fact, recently I got an email from someone from a Northern California agency who says, "Hey, I'm really impressed with what you and Leap are doing. I want you to know." I try to convert him, but he's really busy. So, I think what happens is law enforcement, in my experience, I don't know how it is in Colorado, when I went to the police academy, there was never any training on why our drug laws developed. And I always try to point out to people that when I was in the police academy at 21 years old, if I would have known, because I'm Hispanic, I was born in Mexico City, if in a police academy setting where they're teaching you how to enforce the law, they don't teach you the reason the law became implemented. And so in the 1930s with the Marijuana Tax Act is marijuana was made illegal, quite frankly, because of racism. It was directed at the Hispanic population coming up out of the southwest border. You know, the same thing can be said about other substances as well. And so what happens is we've perpetuated these policies that if there was really an open and honest dialogue in law enforcement where these laws came from, I believe that most law enforcement officers would rethink their position. So I think the beauty of what LEAP is doing is going out and trying to build consensus with law enforcement leaders and judiciary to say, you know, we need to craft a win-win situation. And right now, you know, part of my pet peeve has been is the impact of law enforcement lobbying and the impediment of drug reform across our country. You know, I don't know how Colorado is, but I know in California it becomes self-perpetuating. So you have, you know, the California chiefs or the California narcotics officers who spend a piece over $100,000 a year to pay a lobbyist to go and lobby politicians to ensure that drug reform doesn't occur. And so law enforcement has lost its way in some aspects. I love my profession. I'm incredibly proud of the service to my community that I did. But we were placed into the executive branch of the judiciary for a particular reason. We are to enforce laws. We're not to legislate them. And so in what I've seen across the nation is that when medical marijuana passes in states, is law enforcement and their leaders work to not develop a strategy and create a win-win strategy, but to undermine the law. And so we need to make law enforcement, not make, but encourage law enforcement to come to the table and to look at a different paradigm, that what all of us are trying to do is create a win-win for them. I don't want to see any more police officers killed by continuing to enforce prohibition that doesn't work. And I don't want any other mother to lose their child, whether it's on our side of the border or on the Mexican side of the border. And I don't want to see any more of our kids stigmatized and have their lives ruined because they made a mistake, because that's not what America should be about.
To address some of the points about Colorado that you mentioned, in Colorado, what we have seen is a couple of things. Specific to law enforcement response, the medical marijuana system is regulated, it is enforced by law enforcement officers, by police officers, essentially, who are responsible for ensuring that there is no diversion, that inventories are being handled properly, that the people who are making purchases in those medical marijuana stores are allowed to do so by virtue of having applied to the registry and presenting appropriate ID. And when those law enforcement officers speak out in support of a regulated system, they are censured for having done so by the establishment, which is unfortunate because, as you say, there are many law enforcement officers who recognize the failures of marijuana prohibition and wish that they could be spending their time in more effective manners. This is not what I hear off the record, is that this is not why I became a cop.
Correct.
And so additionally, to address the racial disparities, we do see significant disparities in Colorado. In particular, we see that that marijuana prohibition is enforced against blacks and in black communities much more heavily than against whites.
Suburban kids.
Certainly. And, well, I suppose statistically that's harder to say because we haven't been able to find those breakdowns. The statistical breakdowns are notoriously difficult to get. But what we do know is that blacks are 4.4% of Coloradans and 8.8% of marijuana arrests, I believe, in 2010, something like this. And we see that same kind of pattern every year. And that's the reason why we've been joined by the Colorado Criminal Justice Coalition, by the ACLU of Colorado, by the NAACP of Colorado, and by many other social justice and racial justice leaders who see that that marijuana prohibition in Colorado, that our ineffective marijuana policy is disproportionately impacting black communities.
Sure. No, you know what, I think that goes across the nation. Mm-hmm. You know, it's unfortunate, and you know, the question was asked is, there's an old saying in law enforcement is you don't talk about law enforcement, and then you don't talk about law enforcement. And so this blog that I wrote recently was, because the end of that quote, it was by a police officer who wrote it in a magazine based on a LEAP member being terminated because he came out for Proposition 19, and a Border Patrol agent that was fired by U.S. Customs Service because he had a private conversation with another officer and mentioned LEAP and talked about the failure of the drug war. And so at the line level, we understand it's a failure. And I think it's the leadership, because there's entrenched interest. There's asset forfeiture, there is block grants, there's money, fiscal coercion coming down from the federal government. And I think that's important for all of us to recognize is they're making certain that they force their policies on us, and that's not, again, under the 10th Amendment, that's not what states' rights is about. And if you really dig deep further, Antonin Scalia, the most conservative Supreme Court justice, stated unequivocally a year ago that it was the worst thing for the federal judiciary that the federal government started prosecuting any type of drug offense at the federal level. That should be left to the individual states to decide how they're going to implement their policies. And I think that's something that we all need to push is, it's been an unmitigated disaster. The homicide rate back in the 1960s was at 91%. It's now down to 61% solvability factor. And I believe it's a direct correlation and caused by our over-enforcement of our drug laws.
And when it comes to why moms and dads in Colorado can stand up and say marijuana prohibition is a failed policy and I want my kids to be safer, so I'm voting yes on 64. We can look to these law enforcement issues, in terms of creating safer communities, but also safer spaces in terms of use and access for youth.
Absolutely.
Excellent discussion, ladies.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming and speaking with us today on behalf of Amendment 64, and thank the audience for joining us this evening. And thank you so much.
We're still live.
We are still live. Okay. So we have a couple more minutes, so I think we're going to go ahead and utilize every second that we can get and have some closing statements from our two lovely panelists. Maybe just your key.
My key thing is, remember, it's counterintuitive, but control and regulation of the market will create a zone of safety for your child. Period, simple, end of story. Let's remove the black market, the violence, and take the people who have no desire to keep your child safe out of it.
80 years ago, a group of women, the National Organization of Women for Prohibition Reform, led the charge to end alcohol prohibition. And those women fought to ensure that their children would have safer communities. We can do the same now in Colorado. Because of the efforts of moms and women like that, of parents in that group and in others, Colorado was one of the first states to repeal their alcohol prohibition laws. And Colorado has the opportunity right now to look at a failed policy and make positive change for our state, our children, and our communities. And the comparisons are endless. Alcohol prohibition empowered criminals, and marijuana prohibition empowers criminals. We have an opportunity to vote yes on Amendment 64 to keep our children and our state safer.
Thank you very much.
There we go.
There we go. All right.